All right, let's open up a case file on one of the biggest objections to the Bible's reliability you'll ever hear. The idea that the Gospels contradict each other. But we're not just going to look at it the old way. We're going to see it through the eyes of a cold case homicide detective.
And we're going to start with this quote from a detective that just turns the whole debate completely on its head. He's saying that when eyewitness stories are too perfect, that's what makes him suspicious. So what if the very thing that critics point to as a weakness is actually a sign of strength?
But first, we have to hear from the prosecution. Let's really understand the skeptic's accusation. And look, it's a powerful argument, and it's one you've probably heard a bunch of times. The whole idea is that the Gospels just aren't reliable because they're full of differences.
So the thinking goes something like this. If a book is really from God, it should be absolutely perfect, right? Word for word. But then you open up the four Gospels, and you see they tell the same stories, but with different details, maybe a different order, and they emphasize different things. The claim is that all these little differences add up. It's like a death by 1,000 paper cuts that all together drain the text of its authority.
Okay, now let's call our expert witness to the stand. Let's just forget theology for a second. We're investigators now. We're looking at eyewitness testimony from a crime scene. What do we look for?
And this is where everything flips. You see, the very first thing a detective does at a crime scene is separate the witnesses. Why? Because they actually don't want them to get their story straight. If every witness gives the exact same word-for-word testimony, that's a massive red flag for collusion. It sounds like they rehearsed it. Real detectives expect messy, varied accounts. That's what truth looks like. Each person sees things from a different angle, they notice different details, and it's by putting all those messy pieces together that you get a real, three-dimensional picture of what happened.
And that leads us to this really important idea about what divine inspiration even means. The idea isn't that the gospel writers were just robots, with God dictating every word like a CEO to a secretary. No, they were penmen. They were inspired individuals who used their own unique personalities, their memories, their writing styles to communicate God's truth. And that's exactly why we get 4 distinct portraits of Jesus, not 4 identical photocopies.
So this all brings us to a really crucial question, one that kind of shifts the entire investigation. Is the problem really with the evidence itself? Or is it with the expectations that we, the investigators, bring to the table?
All right, now it's time to get really specific, because this is where so many of these arguments fall apart. You have to understand that there is a huge difference between a simple variation and a true contradiction.
So a real contradiction isn't just a difference in the story. It's an impossible conflict. For 2 statements to actually contradict, they have to be mutually exclusive. One has to be true and the other has to be false. A variation, on the other hand, is just a difference in reporting that can totally exist at the same time.
Okay, let's put this to the test with a classic example, one that gets brought up all the time. Matthew and Mark's Gospels say there was 1 angel at Jesus' tomb, but then Luke and John say there were 2. Well, that seems like a pretty open and shut case, right? A clear contradiction. 1 versus 2.
But hold on, is it really? If we use our detective's definition, it's actually not a contradiction at all. Think about it. If there were 2 angels at the tomb, then it is also 100% true that there was 1 angel at the tomb. It's just simple logic. Matthew and Mark might have just focused on the angel who did the talking, the main character in that part of the story. Saying there was 1 angel doesn't mean there was only 1 angel. So the accounts aren't contradictory, they're complementary. Each one just adds another piece to the puzzle. Okay, so now let's zoom out a bit. We've looked at the eyewitness testimony, but what about the hard evidence, the documents themselves? How do the gospel manuscripts stack up against other ancient writings that we just accept as fact?
Well, the amount of evidence we have here it's just staggering. We have more than 5,800 Greek manuscripts for the New Testament. Now compare that to the next best thing, Homer's Iliad, which has around 1,800 copies. And for most other ancient books, like Caesar's Gallic Wars, we might only have a couple hundred copies, and nobody questions if Caesar was real. I mean, by any historical standard, the manuscript evidence for the New Testament is an absolute embarrassment of riches.
And because we have so many copies to compare, textual scholars are over 99% confident that they can piece together the original text. That tiny little bit that's still up for debate, it's mostly just spelling variations or tiny scribal notes that don't change a single core belief.
And it's not just the documents. Archaeology, literally vindication by the spade, has backed up the Bible time and time again. For instance, people used to say the whole Hittite civilization mentioned in the Bible was a myth, until archaeologists dug up their capital city. The same thing happened with figures like Pontius Pilate and cities like Ur. So many times, what critics called a historical error just turned out to be a gap in our own knowledge. Okay, so if the evidence for the manuscripts is so strong, and if these so-called contradictions are actually what a detective would expect to find in real testimony, then why is this still such a huge debate? Well, the answer might have less to do with the evidence and more to do with the person looking at it.
So check this out. It's like two detectives at the exact same crime scene. You have Bruce Metzger, one of the world's top scholars on New Testament manuscripts, and then you have his star student, Bart Ehrman. They both looked at the exact same evidence, the same manuscripts, the same variations, yet Metzger remained a committed Christian his whole life, while Ehrman became one of the most famous skeptics in the world. So, what changed? It wasn't the evidence.
This really suggests that the final verdict often comes down to our presuppositions, what we believe before we even look at the evidence. If you start with a bias that says miracles are impossible, then no amount of historical evidence for something like the resurrection is ever going to be enough. The evidence gets filtered through that prior belief. The objection isn't really about history anymore, it's about philosophy.
And that's exactly what Detective Wallace is saying here. It's about the commitments you bring to the case file. I mean, think about it. If you take the miracles out of the story, almost no serious historian on the planet doubts that a man named Jesus of Nazareth lived and was crucified. The debate isn't about the man, it's about the miracles. It's a clash of worldviews, not just words on a page.
So, where does this leave us? Well, when you start looking at the Gospels through the eyes of a detective, the whole case just looks different. The warts and all nature of the accounts, the very things that skeptics see as fatal flaws, suddenly start to look like the hallmarks of authenticity that an investigator is trained to find. So maybe the real question isn't whether the evidence is perfect, but whether we're willing to follow it wherever it leads.